My name is Logan Court, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. When we held Clark Forum events in person on campus, we took a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered belonged to Indigenous peoples for centuries prior to European settlement. Currently, I am inhabiting the ancestral land of the Manahoac and the Patawomac, and I encourage everyone watching this evening's program to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose traditional land you currently inhabit. On behalf of Dickinson College and the Clark Forum, the Department of Environmental Studies and the Popel Shaw Center for Race and Ethnicity, and organized in collaboration with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, The State of Environmental Justice in Pennsylvania. The issues of water and air pollution in conjunction have been around for decades and have become hot-button issues in political conversations. The state of Pennsylvania is no exception. However, exceptionally high rates of deforestation and pollution from coal mining and fracking make Pennsylvania a particularly harrowing case of negative environmental change. The effects of water and air pollution in the state disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color due to discriminatory and exploitative tendencies to place factories, waste processing plants, and mining operations near low-income and minority-populated communities. In the early 1980s, the concept of environmental justice emerged to help counteract the unfair distribution of environmental burdens. The field applies environmental law, science, and government planning to reach more equitable balance of burdens through litigation and social planning. Tonight's event is a panel discussion on the topic of environmental justice in Pennsylvania. Saleem Chapman is the Deputy Director of the Philadelphia Office of Sustainability and is responsible for the Green Works Project, a vision for sustainable Philadelphia. He also oversees the city's climate preparedness and resilience strategy, as well as the application for a racial equity lens to sustainability. Veronica Coptis is the Executive Director at the Center for Coalfield Justice. Her upbringing and life in Pennsylvania have inspired her work at CCJ. And before joining the CCJ staff, Coptis served on the board of directors for CCJ and organized with the Mountain Watershed Association. Adam Cutler is an attorney and member of the Environmental Practice Group at Fox Rothschild LLP. Cutler was appointed in 2011 to serve on the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and since 2018 has served as its chair. He also serves as an officer on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Resource Council, on the Pennsylvania Bar Association Environmental and Energy Law Section Council, and on the Waste Reduction and Recycling Work Group of the Lower Merion Township Sustainability Task Force. Horace Strand currently serves as the chairman of the Chester Environmental Partnership and as a member of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection Environmental Justice Advisory Board. Strand is also serving as the executive manager of the Stormwater Authority of the City of Chester, and Strand is the recipient of the NAACP George Raymond Freeman Award. Heather Bedi is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Dickinson College. Bedi's research examines how civil society and socioeconomic movements experience and adapt to natural resource and landscape modifications related to energy processes, climate change, industrialization, and agricultural transitions. Bedi also examines energy injustice through the lens of shale gas extraction, fracking in the United States, and she serves on the Pennsylvania Department for Environmental Protection's Environmental Justice Advisory Board. There'll be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please type your questions into the live chat next to this YouTube video at any time during the presentation. And we will now begin the presentation, and I will turn it over to Professor Bedi.
Hi, good evening. My name is Heather Bedi, and I appreciate the introduction from Logan. Thank you so much. And I appreciate all of our panelists being here with us tonight. And I appreciate the Clark Forum for allowing this event to move forward, and also the Department of Environmental Protection for increasingly focusing on environmental justice issues, increasingly through the Environmental Justice Advisory Board that I serve on, that Adam serves on, and Dr. Strand as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a question at a time, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond in turn, roughly for about 5 minutes. So this first question I'm going to ask Veronica Coptis to respond to first. Veronica, can you please give us some insight into what are key Pennsylvania environmental justice landmark moments for you and those you work with in Western Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start that question. And I think Um, I think there are others on this call who have been involved in some more of the key Pennsylvania environmental justice landmarks. I've been organizing for about a decade, and I know the fight for environmental justice and getting some real protection started well before that in Pennsylvania, and a lot of that work was led out of Chester County in the state. But on the western half of the region, I, like from some of my mentors, have learned that there was a core role of like rural leaders in the coalfields also coming together to fight for environmental justice. And more recently, I think some landmarks that we've had is being able to protect some public streams in a state park from being undermined by a longwall coal mining operation. And then, like, historically in the early 80s, a crew of community members just kind of came together and organized and stopped an entire valley in Greene County from being dammed up and becoming a freshwater lake to feed the coal mine as well. And then with the work that happened statewide, I think the formation of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board was a landmark moment in our history, as well as nationally when environmental justice was fought. That kind of forced states to start engaging in environmental justice practices in the regulatory level.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Next, we're going to turn to Dr. Strand to give us some insight from Chester, Pennsylvania and beyond. And then we'll hear from Adam Cutler and then from Saleem Chapman. So Dr. Strand, can you tell us a bit about your thoughts on landmark environmental justice moments for you and those you work with?
Environmental justice times that I can think of is when the Public Interest Law Center joined the Chester community in the fight against environmental, we call it racism then. Environmental justice is a politically correct term that's used to acceptable terms to everybody as far as correcting the problem, and that's great. But at that time it was environmental racism. And we partnered with the Phil Kopp and Jerry Balter, one of the leading attorneys for environmental justice issues with Phil Kopp, educated the community as to what their rights was and what we need to do to position ourselves to be heard in the courts and also in the political arena. And Jerry was successful in taking this fight all the way to the US Supreme Court, winning in every court. And the issue became moot in the US Supreme Court because the company that was in the lawsuit went bankrupt and it was no longer an issue. So I think that's one of the biggest landmark moments that I think we can talk about. And as a result of the work that we done in Chester and through the efforts of all who have partnered with us, Chester is one of the leading environmental justice communities in the country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strand. And Dr. Strand, if you could turn your video on, if that is a possibility, please do so. And that was a nice.
Well, my screen is saying that my host has locked me out. We've been talking about that.
Okay, hopefully we can get that technology sorted out. I appreciate everyone's patience with our new format here on Zoom. So that actually is a nice segue thinking about environmental law, because Adam Cutler, as you all heard, is an environmental law specialist. So Adam, if you could walk us through what you see as landmark environmental justice moments in Pennsylvania, clearly from your legal expertise. I know you have a specific bent.
Okay, straighten it out, okay.
Again, thanks to the Clark Forum for hosting us, and hopefully the technology is working. Yeah, to build on what Dr. Strand spoke about, the Chester Residents for Quality Living, Concern for Quality Living case, is established a private right of action under Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act. And that allowed environmental justice claims to be provable in court by showing a disparate impact rather than needing to show that there was intentional discrimination at work. The standards are quite different, because it really takes kind of a smoking gun to prove intentional discrimination. You need somebody on the record saying, I made this decision specifically. So disparate impact allows you to prove it circumstantially by showing the effect of the decision has a discriminatory impact on a particular protected group. And that's what the Chester residence case helped establish. And as Dr. Strand said, Jerry Balter was the legal mind behind that theory. We have Jerry and the Chester community and other communities on their shoulders for sure. Unfortunately, the decision in Chester residence, the holding really of the case, was undone a few years later in the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Alexander v. Sandoval. In that case, which had nothing to do with environmental justice, did have to do with Title VI, and unfortunately, the decision of the court was to eliminate the availability of private right of action legal theories. I think that that has required a great degree of creativity on the part of those communities and their advocates in the almost 20 years since then. Another thing, just from an institutional standpoint, that the Chester residence case brought us was a Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection that was motivated to make some changes in the way it did business. And so in 1999, following the Chester residence case, it convened the Environmental Justice Work for 2 years or so on a report to the department that recommended a whole series of actions to take in pursuit of environmental justice. And invoking the principles of environmental justice that had been established in the late 80s and early 90s. And so that report of the work group led to the creation of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board and what was then called DEP's Office of Environmental Advocate, which placed environmental advocates in various regions of the state to work directly with communities, environmental justice communities, and the organizations and groups that arose in those communities to help the residents. That office has since been transformed and kind of reimagined into the Office of Environmental Justice as it exists today. And for that, we have all of the members of that environmental justice work group, as well as former DEP Secretary Jim Seif and former Governor Ridge, to thank, as well as the current administration. Governor Wolf and Secretary McDonough made it a point to keep environmental justice a vital part of the work of DEP today. The other thing that I would point to, and this is straying a bit from the legal framework, but I found it important as an environmental justice landmark in Pennsylvania. In about 10 years ago, it was either 2009 or 2010, DEP and Drexel University, among others, sponsored the first statewide environmental justice conference, which was held in Harrisburg and brought together residents of EJ communities from across the state, along with grassroots organizers and organizations, public interest lawyers, local, state, federal agency staff, and other advocates of environmental justice. It was really a unique opportunity to bring these folks together. The biggest takeaway for me was seeing community members, some of whom I was working with and representing at the time, seeing them sharing their experiences with the other communities that they met, the other folks that they met from different parts of the state, what strategies worked, what strategies they ran into trouble with, and having an opportunity to kind of celebrate their successes and build off of the challenges and obstacles that they faced. It really was inspiring because people could see they weren't alone in dealing with these environmental justice, environmental racism. Let's call it what it is: environmental racism in their communities. There were others who were dealing with the same thing, who had been there before, and there were advocates and even government agencies who could serve as resources and support. So that's where I'll leave it.
Excellent, Adam. And your Wi-Fi got better, which we're all grateful for.
Good.
Such important information. And I think what was really key, and I think what all of our panelists so far have really highlighted, is that these processes are dynamic. So there's going to be some upsets, there's going to be some victories, but we have to take moments to actually enjoy some of those victories, but also learn from them and share with others. And a group of us through the Environmental Justice Advisory Board are planning an environmental justice symposium in the spring, actually to get groups together, maybe virtually, hopefully in person if everything's safe, in the spring, to do exactly what Adam was talking about, to kind of learn from one another, but also have that inspiration, because it can be challenging work. So Saleem, Chapman, I'll pass this question off to you as well. So historically, what are you seeing as key environmental justice landmark moments from your vantage point?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and thank you for having me here this evening. So, I work for the city of Philadelphia, and certainly I won't do justice to the significant amount of grassroots activism that has sort of established a deep legacy of environmental justice work in the city of Philadelphia. But what I will say is that what the city has been able to do, sort of paying homage to some of that activism, is in 2019, the city of Philadelphia adopted legislation to establish the city's first commission on environmental justice. And I think that's really taken the lead from some of sort of the successful strategies that were established at the federal government when Executive Order 12898 was signed underneath President Clinton, as well as some of the great efforts that were done at the state level that Adam just referred to. But I'll also sort of highlight, just kind of building on a point that Adam made, was looking a little bit outside of Pennsylvania, but is relevant to here, is that there isn't any federal legislation around environmental justice, despite this been an issue that has sort of been around for almost 30 years. There isn't any dedicated legal framework for us to point to. As of right now, all we do have is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But what was really profound recently, there was actually just legislation passed in the House just last month that was actually fixing some of the legal unworkings that the Sandoval case did that Adam was just referring to. So there was the Clean Energy and Innovation Job Act passed in the House. And what that actually does is it strengthen the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to actually allow private citizens to bring action around disparate impact, which is something that currently isn't allowed. So I think that, as well as looking to the recent legislation that was passed in New Jersey around cumulative impacts, are both really important things that, while have not happened in Pennsylvania just yet, certainly establish a precedent for us to follow.
Definitely. The recent legislation in New Jersey is definitely inspiring to think if that could potentially lead other states to follow suit, and then thinking through the potential for federal legislation, particularly since I know Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey is really a large advocate on these issues. So if we can get the momentum and the support, maybe it's possible. So Veronica, I'm going to ask you to start with the next one. Thinking through a little bit about your context in Western Pennsylvania, dealing with fracking and coal issues, if you could explain a little bit about kind of what environmental injustice looks like in your particular area, but also how do community groups actually come together to organize around some of the environmental injustices that are happening, and maybe that creates kind of unusual collaborations or things that you wouldn't necessarily think folks who wouldn't normally come together. So if you could orient us a little bit to your region of Pennsylvania, and then tell us a little bit about community organizing.
Yeah, and this is Rory for folks who might have been wondering. In the day of Zoom, we have children that participate in our stuff too, which I think is good. But I think, so I'm in Western Pennsylvania. I am actually in the very southwestern corner, and we're at the epicenter of the boom of fracking. So, and then also extreme underground coal mining, which is a longwall mining. And so usually the statement we use is that if you're living in southwestern Pennsylvania, you're often living above a coal mine operation or adjacent to a fracking operation. Like those are the options for residents and how they're navigating protecting their water and things like that. And the risk that comes is health, and how environmental justice plays in. I think it is important to note that we have environmental justice because the way environmental racism was used and was talked about before, and that there are other ways too that our environmental justice system doesn't look at cumulative impact. And so you could actually have 100 industrial facilities in your community, and that's not an indicator of whether you're an at-risk community or you're labeled an environmental justice community. And so I think we have to go beyond just income and race to really measure the communities across the state of Pennsylvania that are at risk for undue or cumulative exposure. And we see that so often in our communities. The other aspect is how much power do the communities have? And so an example is we organize our residents by just convening them together, having neighbors talk to each other, not letting industry pick one neighbor off by the next neighbor to sign different agreements. In an instance, this is your mom. Yes. Okay, Roy, could you be quiet for a second? But we door knocked and we talked to folks, and around that state park where we protected a stream, over 4,000 people in this community asked the state to deny the permit to do full extraction mining under these streams, and the state still issued it. So in this instance, how do residents feel that they have any power to have any influence over what happens or doesn't happen in their communities? And that's the uphill battle in our organizing. Time and time again, residents collectively come together, demand that the state regulatory agencies make a different decision than what they choose to do so. We've won because our organization has litigated those decisions in the end, but many communities across the state of Pennsylvania don't have an organization like the Center for Coalfield Justice that can litigate, nor do they have the money to take that battle on. We were lucky to have private donors that were helping support that cost. And so I think moving forward, it's really just talking to folks, explaining the power dynamics that exist. And, the steps we're going to go moving forward is pushing back on the political control that the fossil fuel industry has in the state by building people power across the whole state. So an unlikely partnership I'll talk about is, we do work with retired coal miners that you would think don't care about climate or the environment, but they do. They live in these communities, they recreate in these parks. And so we'll bring a lot of those voices into the space, as well as we are part of the Pennsylvania State Climate Equity Table, which is a coalition across the state of Pennsylvania that is immigrant rights group, racial justice group, education, economic, and environment, all coming together to talk about how we move equitable climate policy in the state of Pennsylvania that doesn't leave any community or any identity out of the solution.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I think Veronica really articulates kind of the breadth of environmental injustices and challenges that we face in Pennsylvania. I've taken my students out on a wonderful field trip that Veronica led, and she showed us sites where there's fracking pads right next to coal fields that are also right next to low-income housing. And so there's this real convergence of kind of extreme challenges in terms of not having a lot of economic opportunity and having, the local burger flipping joint is the only place to get a good paying job once coal jobs are leaving. So there's a lot of issues that are arising in that area. And I think Veronica's group is taking a really interesting approach. So Dr. Strand, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you could orient us a little bit to kind of what are the kind of main environmental injustices right now in Chester and beyond, and how are community groups coming together at this moment to organize on the issues that are still pressing and ongoing?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share. In the city of Chester, what we have done is we've organized a group called the Chester Environmental Partnership, CEP. And basically, this group consists of stakeholders, the industries, representatives. We have the Department of Environmental Protection from DEP. We also have the EPA. We have academia associated with us. We work with the Penn's Department of Toxicology, and we have representatives from Widener as well as Swarthmore, and sometimes from Drexel's and other universities, and community leaders there on a daily basis to monitor the industries that are currently operating in our community, and also positioning ourselves to keep any further clustering of unfriendly facilities into our community. All this came as a result of the work that we have done over the past 20 years dealing with the clustering effect. As you might know or may not know, the main suit that we was dealing with had to do with the DEP's permitting of environmentally unfriendly facilities in one area. And basically, they were issuing permits on a frequent basis to these unfriendly facilities in Chester. We had the fourth largest transfer steam plant in the country, the largest infection medical autoclave facility. We had a rock crushing company called Abenizio. We were on the border with Delcora Sewage Treatment Facility, and they were getting ready to permit another company to burn contaminated soil. And it was just unheard of how rapidly these permits were being issued in comparison to what was taking place in other parts of Pennsylvania. So we saw ourselves invaded by waste industry. And as a result of the fight, we organized community and we educated ourselves, and we better understood how these things work. When you deal with the regulatory agencies and you go to them and you complain about the industries and what they're doing in your community, they will tell you that they only look at the technology and determine whether or not the technology is safe, and they do not tell the industries where to put their facilities. That's up to the local municipality and the zoning commission to determine whether or not they want these facilities in your community. And so what we learned is that we were protesting against the regulatory agencies, thinking that that was going to give us some help, but we found out that the biggest battle was right there in our local community. And so we reorganized the community so that the community would be present at zoning board hearings and planning hearings and in position before these companies try to come into our community so that our voice would be heard then. And then also we realized that if the political structure was not helping us protect our communities, then we had power to vote. And so in most cases, we voted them out. And now most of the leaders who are running our community have been a part of the environmental justice movement. There's one particular community in particular, it's called Keystone. This was a unique situation because the state of Pennsylvania had gave a grant to a company to come in and to crush metals in their community, and they had got the permission from the zoning board, and the community did not know anything about it until after it all had been done. And so the community organized and was ready to take buses to Harrisburg and to, knock on the doors of the DP and the governor and everybody else to fight, because they felt that that was the direction that they should go. And I was able to go in and say to them, listen, you're going in the wrong direction. You need to go a few blocks from your house to where your local municipality is, where your local hearing board, and fight these individuals who made this decision to bring this facility into your community. As a result of that, they fought, and even though this industry had been given grants from the state of Pennsylvania to establish their facility in Eddystone, the facility shut down and moved out, and the zoning board and some of the local officials now are some of the people who are involved in the movement. You have to understand as residents where the battle begins. It doesn't begin with the regulatory agency. It's the local government that makes the decision. Each local municipality has autonomy. And so we have poised ourselves to have a daily communication with our elected officials. We have on our board our city council persons. Sometimes the mayor attends. We're right there with the health department. Everybody who makes decisions about the quality of life in our community, we deal with them on a daily basis, so that if anything is happening or anything is going down, the community's in position to voice its concern and to represent itself in a way that it protects its own interests. That's what is so important, and that's what we learn in environmental justice, and that's what we do in Chester on a daily basis. And as a result of that, we're one of the most monitored communities anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania. And for the past 10, 15 years, we have not seen any major industries that we would consider undesirable industry environmentally. Another thing I want to point out is Kimberly-Clark, which you might know as Scott Paper Company. They were burning coal for numbers of years in the city of Chester, and they were one of the biggest problems as far as polluting the air. And we were able to sit down with them and to encourage them to change their method of energy. And they now are working with the state and also with the community to install gas burning furnaces to operate their facility, which is going to reduce tremendously the carbon print that they have going into air and the pollution that they've been known for a number of years. And this only happened because we were able to sit down at the table with them. What we find through CEP is that, sitting down, dialoguing respectfully and talking to industries and talking to your elected officials about your problem goes a long way. It works pretty well if everybody has the same interest. Because once you present a legitimate issue, you have the facts, and they're easily to be understood and hard to resist, they have to make a decision. They have to say, we're going to help the community or we're not. And most cases, those who want to serve don't want to be on record saying that they don't want to help. So this has been a great work. Plus, we have the intellect, the scientists that are on our board that can monitor and speak the language that the scientists speak, break it down so that the layperson can understand it, and everybody is knowledgeable and everybody knows what's going on in our community. So I would say in closing in my statement in regards to that is that it's very important that the community understand its power and that your environmental justice starts right there where you live, with the people you elect on a daily basis to run your community. Hold them accountable and make sure that you know what decisions they're making, because if they make private deals with these industries and sign on a dotted line and everything's done and you find out after the fact, it's pretty hard to get them uprooted from your community.
Yeah, so many lessons coming out of what Dr. threw in there, but a couple I wrote down. Vote, everyone please do so. Hold your local officials accountable and engage in dialogue with stakeholders that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think share your values, but if you start speaking with them, maybe you can find some common ground, which is really in conflict resolution, that's a key strategy. So I'm going to go in a slightly different order, if that's okay. Saleem, Chapman, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you could orient us a little bit on environmental injustices just a bit north of Chester and Philly, and thinking through how community groups are coming together. And then Adam, if you wouldn't mind kind of reflecting on the law part of that after Saleem is done, kind of how and if community groups are engaging with the environmental legal framework.
Yeah, I think Dr. Strand sort of gave a perfect segue to my comments. I alluded to it earlier that in 2019, the city of Philadelphia established an Environmental Justice Advisory Commission. And really, the genesis of that was really the idea that most of the expertise around this work really exists outside of government. And really those who are both best situated to speak on it are those who are on the front lines of the issue. So as government, it's really important for us to make sure that we're doing everything we can to provide the opportunities and removing whatever institutional barriers exist so that that perspective is really leading the formation of policies and programs that are attempting to alleviate environmental racism. And that's sort of the goals that we've led with. I think in terms of orienting the challenges that Philadelphia faces, I think it's the same as everywhere else. I think you look at most places and I think you can trace back present day issues to longstanding policy decisions and programmatic decisions, whether you're talking about zoning policy, whether you're talking about housing policy, such as redlining, whether you're talking about urban renewal districts. I think all these things continue to have a significant impact on environmental risk in the city of Philadelphia. So if we look at, what's our most flood-prone neighborhood, that is a neighborhood that was an urban renewal district. If we look at what is our most heat vulnerable neighborhood, that's a neighborhood that was connected to redlining. And so I think for us is really making sure that in addition to assuring that the communities are sort of in the leadership role of developing policies to address these things, it's also making sure that the policies that we implement is really getting at the root cause. And sometimes we're just sort of looking at addressing the immediate issue without necessarily having a solution that's comprehensive enough to really get down to where the root of the problem lies.
Yeah, another great point, looking for local expertise, because I think what's really interesting through my Environmental Justice Advisory Board work is like, there's really that need to open the space to make sure we're hearing from folks who may not consider themselves experts, but really are the experts in terms of seeing and watching and holding their local folks, local representatives accountable, as Dr. Strand was saying. So Adam, on this same point, like from your vantage point, how are you seeing community groups kind of engaging with the environmental legal process? I know Veronica mentioned it a little bit before, but it would be interesting to get your perspective on the role of community groups in relation to environmental law.
Yeah, sure. I think, just to make the connection to the points Veronica was raising earlier, one way of doing that is by either appealing Department of Environmental Protection actions. You can do that to a special hearing board called the Environmental Hearing Board in Pennsylvania, which has judges with expertise in environmental law specifically, as opposed to going to a general court where the judge you get may or may not know the ins and outs of environmental law. It is more rare, I would say, that you see community groups these days filing lawsuits in court as opposed to permit appeal or administrative appeal proceedings, just because the expense is so significant. There are some groups like Veronica's group, like the Delaware River Keeper and Penn Future, that do, thanks to some good fundraising and contributions, do have the opportunity to litigate cases, some of which go to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and some of which help establish and revitalize, for example, the Environmental Rights Amendment of the Pennsylvania Constitution. The most recent case that did that was brought by an environmental organization, and they made good law as a result for the EJ community and for Pennsylvania's environment as a whole. Another thing, and I think probably the way that most most community groups interact with the legal framework in Pennsylvania is through either the DEP's enhanced public participation policy for environmental justice, or through the normal public comment and public hearing process that's available whenever the Department of Environmental Protection takes certain actions, particularly in the regulatory field or in connection with certain permits. So that, I think, is probably the way that most people tend to interact at the state level with that legal framework. The policy, for those who aren't aware, basically says that we look at census tracts based on census data. There are certain thresholds. It's 20% living below the federal poverty line, or 30% of the population is a minority group, and those census tracts are designated as EJ areas. If a particular project, a particular permit holder wants to start a new project in an area that's within a half-mile radius of any of those census tracts that are designated as EJ areas, they have to go through an enhanced process beyond the normal permitting process. And what it entails, really, first of all, this is all done by policy. It's not a law. It's not even a regulation. It's just a policy of the department. And so as a result of that, it's voluntary for the companies to participate who are seeking permits. It only applies to certain permits. So that further limits the types of activities that fall within this policy. But what it does is it gives environmental justice communities the opportunity both to get kind of a plain language description of what the project is and what it will mean to their community. They'll get some opportunities to submit public comment or go to public hearings and provide their comments in person. And sometimes it results in the permit holder or the person who's trying to get the permit sitting down with the community and talking through their concerns and issues separate and apart from the formal part of the process. And I would say, and this echoes, I think, Dr. Strand's comments, the time when that is the most fruitful, the time when that interaction between the permittee or the permit seeker and the community is the most fruitful, I've found, is before the permit gets submitted, before the application gets submitted to the department for review. Because then the community has a little bit more leverage, and they, they're not in the situation of Keystone where the deal had already been struck and they had to figure out through a lot of community organizing where they could find those pressure points, and eventually they did. But it took a lot of meetings in living rooms and porches, and it took a lot of creativity and finding the right way to do it through the help of Dr. Strand and his group to get them pointed in that direction. I think also of the Hunting Park community in North Philadelphia, which was a community that I was able to work with. They organized really around the idea of protecting the community's children from environmental health risks, primarily relating to their schools. They saw in their community that schools were located close to, in one particular case, a construction and demolition waste recycling facility. And they had community meetings at their local schools. All of the general community meetings before they started thinking about environmental issues were largely based in the schools. And so it was kind of a natural for them to merge these ideas of protecting their kids in school and encouraging their kids' education with the idea of environmental health, both indoor and outdoor environmental health. You know, and so when they had their public meeting with the construction and demolition waste facility, and every member of the community, many of whom had never spoken at a public meeting before and didn't really know where to find their voice, got up to that microphone and spoke passionately about their worries for their children. It made a big difference. And it was one of those situations where talking to the facility, finding common ground, common humanity, really made a big difference. So I think I guess that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, but obviously a huge amount of kind of a need for them to be able to step forward like that, but it's also really hard to put yourself forward like that and find that voice. So definitely an inspiring case. So I wanted us to talk about COVID-19, but I am aware of time and I know that we are going to have some Q&A, and just a reminder to the audience to please put the questions in the chat of YouTube. Please go ahead and put those questions forward. So feel free if anyone in the audience wants a COVID-19 specific question to put that forward, because I wanted to end on an aspirational note just to see from each person what inspires you about current and future opportunities to achieve environmental justice in Pennsylvania and beyond. So I know there's a lot of current challenging issues and kind of realities. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is really furthering and exacerbating systemic racism and educational inequalities and health challenges that we face. But where are each of you kind of inspired or aspiring to something that could lead to tangible change? So why don't we start with Veronica, and then we'll go to Dr. Strand, and then Saleem, and we'll end with Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of relates to COVID and the economic crisis and like the racial justice uprisings, the way we're seeing an intersection of multiple crises hitting in our communities right now. We're also seeing our movements respond in a way that gives me a lot of hope, where we're looking at things with a more intersectional lens across the state and across the nation, and that, you know, housing justice is climate justice, it is environmental justice. Abolition work is also tied to these as well too. And that is kind of what's giving me hope, because it is going to take not looking at these impacts in little boxes on their own to create the solutions moving forward. We're going to have a really better communities in the end, the more that we look at how these boxes intersect and move among each other. And so that's really giving me hope in this moment, the way I'm just seeing unlike partners come together to defend our election, all kinds of stuff in Pennsylvania. It's pretty exciting.
Okay, so inspiration from intersectionality, wonderful. Dr. Strand?
I'm very hopeful because the state of Pennsylvania has taken great effort to do as much as it can do within the guidelines that they are allowed to do within our Constitution to deal with the EV issue. Especially Department of Environmental Protection, even though they're not mandated to do specific things, they have gone out of the way to demonstrate that there's humanity in their decision, and humanity in dealing with the issues of environmental justice. And that makes Pennsylvania one of the leading states in the country in relation to EJ issues. And a lot of times we see them patterning their policy on what comes out of the federal government to the EPA rules that they put out, which are all voluntary rules for states. And so I think that gives me hope, because I know as a one who was a part of suing this Pennsylvania government all the way to the US Supreme Court, I've seen a sincere and a real genuine effort to come back and to deal with the issue of environmental justice in Pennsylvania. So I think the residents of Chester and also the surrounding communities within the state are in a position to go to our regulatory agencies and get the kind of support and help that we need. One of the persons that was really instrumental to me, and I'll be really brief, this was the Department of Advocacy, and Alice Wright, who was one of the leading advocates in that program. She walked the streets of Chester and surrounding communities to empower the community as to what our rights were. And as a result of her work as well, and others and that in your department as well, you know, the state of Pennsylvania is really making a difference. So we're not there yet, but we do have an open ear in our government, and that's important.
Great, faith in humanity, we'll take that. Saleem Chapman.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Veronica said. I think the intersections are really important. I think COVID-19, in a way that I don't think has been in recent history, exposed sort of intersections of race, class, place, and invisibility. And so I think it provides a new framing for us to have these conversations. And I think it's true that particularly those of us who work in advocacy spaces or government, which is sort of known to work in silos, I think we're really understanding the need to work in a way that reflects how people experience these stressors, right? Like people don't experience housing separately from how they experience environmental justice to how they experience economic injustice. And so the onus is really on us to make sure that we're coming together and crafting solutions that really speak to how people are experiencing these things. And then sort of also to the point of sort of seeing the intersections, I think it's how we're able to have a dialogue about these things. I think, you know, the conversations around race and equity and class are happening in places that I just haven't seen them happening in recent history. I think, you know, even at the city of Philadelphia, we're very open and explicit about the need to address structural racism and really put an investment behind that. We have an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So I think these conversations are happening in a more concerted way than I think they have in places that were unlikely to be having them in just, you know, 5-10 years ago.
Thanks so much, Saleem. So intersectional dialogue, again, another great thing for us all to feel inspired by. Adam, any closing thoughts from you and what you feel inspired about today or in the future?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to and echoing the thoughts of my fellow panelists, particularly on the social justice movement, and the you know, I think the significant movement that it has created. But we, you know, as Saleem mentioned earlier, we see states like New Jersey enacting legislation, not just policies, not just promises, but actual legislation to embrace environmental justice principles, to fight against cumulative impacts. I think they have a little bit of ways to go in terms of pulling together the regulations that support that, but you know, they're on their way, and I hope that we'll see that in more states and maybe someday in Pennsylvania. On the national level, again, you know, we heard it mentioned before, but Cory Booker during the presidential campaign was talking about environmental justice, was talking about climate justice. Kamala Harris, same thing. And now we have, you know, at least one party's presidential ticket with, you know, with an environmental platform that includes environmental justice and climate justice. That's never happened before in presidential politics. I think it's a great sign for the future. I think we're really on the cusp of some significant recalibration of the role of environmental justice, both in the states and hopefully, you know, we'll see that nationally, where it's not just going to be about participation. It's not just going to be about having a voice. That's important, but that's only a first step. And what I hope, you know, that New Jersey can show, and what maybe other states will be able to figure out, is how to infuse environmental justice into permitting and enforcement and substantive policymaking, so that it's a part of what government does for us, is is addressed in environmental climate justice issues right up front every day in everything that they do. I think the other thing that is intriguing is, I mentioned it earlier, the Environmental Rights Amendment in Pennsylvania. We don't know yet how courts in Pennsylvania will apply it to environmental justice claims. So that's something that I'm very interested to see as well. And maybe Veronica, you will find the right case to bring. But I don't know. We'll see how that develops. That also leaves me hopeful.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to pass it off to Logan, who is going to field the questions coming in from YouTube and ask it to the group. And if Logan, if you want to direct it to one person or you want my assistance with that, let me know.
All right, thank you, Professor Bedi. I intend to keep the question and answer session short, and I again encourage people to submit any questions they have through the YouTube chat. But otherwise, I'll start with some of the pre-submitted questions. I'm going to direct this first one towards Saleem Chapman, if you want to start us off. And if anyone else would like to hop in and answer, feel free afterwards. But how can the Pennsylvania state government address environmental issues despite the state's large array of city, rural, and small town settings in the state? Or do you think state legislation should be made more on a local level?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we're on this point a little bit earlier. I think what's really needed is that we need to kind of reframe how we think of environmental justice communities. The demographic definition that has historically been used is, I think, somewhat ill-suited, at least for the present day context, to sort of meet the objectives that we're trying to get to. And I know for Philadelphia, when we were implementing our environmental justice ordinance, if we use that demographic definition that Adam so eloquently laid out, that's the whole city. So just based on how we're, our resident composition. And so that doesn't necessarily get to the heart of what we're trying to achieve. So I think, what I would say is is both that we need to kind of rethink how we are thinking about environmental justice communities. I think one way to do that is sort of lead both with pre-existing conditions in a particular community, and as well as setting the outcome standard for where we want communities to be. And I think sort of Adam hit on ultimately sort of the policy aspect of it in his closing thoughts, that I think we're going to need some actual tangible policy, whether at the local level, whether at the state level, that really codifies some of these principles. I think we saw that there can be inconsistency between how these things are implemented, depending on the level of resources, depending on the commitment of any particular agency at any given time. And we even saw that at the federal level. Even 20 years after that executive order, there were federal agencies that hadn't moved forward with those things. So I think that we really need the driver to ensure that we're not only we're setting outcomes, and then we have sort of the impetus to push us towards those outcomes.
Thank you for that. Then our next question is directed towards the whole panel. So whoever would like to respond, feel free. What do the panelists see as the relationship between local EJ struggles and responding to climate change?
I mean, I can start. I just think they're directly connected. Like the local EJ struggle in our community is the extraction of fossil fuels. Well, if we don't extract those and we keep them in the ground, we don't burn them, and we have less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I think the other connection between EJ and one of the principles in climate justice and a principle is like really following local leaders and local control. And we're so far gone in the climate crisis already that we have a lot of climate resiliency planning that has to happen for our communities. And some of the best solutions for that are coming out of, groups on the front lines, on the ground, doing kind of like mom and pop come together solutions. And to really address EJ and address climate justice is to get government. And in some places, government is intersecting with that much more closely, but to get it at a state level, to recognize that we have to do state level climate resiliency planning and that means actually talking to the environmental justice communities, because they know the best solutions out of this.
And I think if I could add, it also ties directly to disinvestment in infrastructure over many, many years. I mean, part of what they're the lowest lying areas, in a community. And I'm going to stop my video so I can maybe deal with my stability issues for a second. They're the lowest lying area. They get flooded. It's going to get more and more, we're going to have more and more wetter weather. So those communities are going to suffer more and more. The urban heat island effect, the fact that cities are more densely packed helps contribute to that, in addition to the lack of investment in trees in urban, some urban centers. So it all comes together. Climate justice is environmental justice is climate justice.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, just to kind of reinforce the point that Veronica made. I think that so often when we talk about environmental justice discourse, we talk about the gaps or the vulnerabilities of a particular community, and leave with sort of a deficit thinking. But I think as we look forward towards the climate crisis, there's so many lessons we can distill from these communities that sort of have been dealing with existential crisis for decades upon decades, where some of us are sort of new to that. I mean, think of the lessons that can be learned from Chester, city of Chester, that we can apply to the climate crisis. And there is communities all across the state who falls in that category. And so I think it's really dependent upon us to lift these communities up as models as we think about how we approach the climate crisis.
All right, and then I have another question for the whole panel. How do we move forward and use the pandemic to transition to cleaner energy?
I mean, that's a hard one. I think Horace, if you want to go, I would love to let you go first.
Well, I think that's a good question. I think one of the things the pandemic does is causes everyone to be more sensitive to the environment. And we have a problem, a lot of antiquated systems that these industries have that causes great pollution in our airway. And if we could encourage them to change to cleaner energy sources, while most of them are struggling because things are shut down, might be a good time to think about addressing that issue. When you look at the whole issue of the environment and the pandemic at the same time, maybe we can, pick out a few industries and say, look, what can you do, and what can we do to help you to reduce, your carbon print in our community. Another thing we're dealing with is the trucks, that hundreds of trucks that we have going throughout our community, emitting the sporadic, fumes from their truck stacks. A lot of these trucks still have not been refitted, to today's standard. So it may be a good time to look at things like that as well.
Yeah, I think I would add with COVID from a higher systemic level is, sometimes there's always the statement like the system's not working, and this big crisis happens with a pandemic and it shows all the cracks in the system, but actually the system's working exactly how it was designed. Racialized capitalism is what drives our economy in the United States, and it only works if there are people who don't have what they need to survive, and there are people at the top that get benefit off of every crisis that happens. So Jeff Bezos with Amazon got how many $1 billion richer from the pandemic happening, while also not providing workers in warehouses, proper healthcare, proper PPE equipment, hiding the increase of the COVID rates that were happening. And so I really think to move out of this, it really takes this creative whole system rehaul thinking. And I think we're in the midst of that, political revolution. More people are getting engaged. We're seeing really great candidates running for office at a multitude of levels this election cycle. that we're going to shift and we're going to be able to create a system, I believe, in my lifetime, where we're not going to have the haves and the have-nots anymore, and really put forward like collective and community care. And COVID has awakened a lot of people to that need that have had the privilege of being, hidden from the dangers and the impacts that our system has created for centuries.
All right, and to end things again on a positive note, our last question for this evening is, again, to the whole panel. How can we best support and empower frontline communities in attempting to expel polluting industries?
Dr. Strand, you want to jump in first on this? Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna say two areas of interest to do that. One, I think we're not giving credibility to the Department of Advocacy in the state, DP, and Environmental Justice Movement. I think that that's a very powerful organization that the state has put in place. If they're empowered to go into these communities and educate the communities when these industries are poised to come into the community, to know what their rights are and how to position themselves to let their voices be heard. As I said before, that was one of the most outstanding factors of our movement, is that we knew what our rights were. And communities need to be educated as to what their rights are. And then I think the other struggle, because they go through learning curves to get to the place they need to get to. And it takes people who have knowledge outside of the government, like private law centers, private public interest law centers, or others who have taken an interest in environmental justice, to come in to help communities get to where they need to get to, so that they can give the kind of attention to their issue and get the kind of respect that's needed to make the people who make decisions listen to them and protect their community. Go ahead, Adam. I think that's my point.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know that I have much to add to that. I think that, in a lot of situations, as Dr. Strand mentioned earlier, where a facility is already in place, where they are meeting their permit requirements, under the laws and regulations in Pennsylvania, at least, the odds are pretty high that they're going to get a renewal the next time they come around, on their usually 5 or 10 year cycle, as long as they're not doing something wrong. If they are doing something wrong, if they're exceeding their permit limitations, or they're violating their permits repeatedly and kind of in a manner that doesn't seem like it's going to get corrected, then the department has the wherewithal and the authorities to revoke permits or issue shutdown orders or things like that. So I think the message maybe to take away for frontline communities is, in addition to, as Dr. Strand says, know your rights, get educated. It's also, be aware of what's going on in your community. Be aware of what the facilities are in your community. There are places to, there are places online. You can look that up. You can even just do Google searches for industrial facilities. You can look on EPA's website or DEP's website. There are various map tools that you can use to find out what's near you, and be vigilant. If you are experiencing problems with a facility that's in your community, you owe it to yourself and your family to be vigilant about that. So I think that's another takeaway is know your rights and know your community, know what's around you, so that when there are problems, you can go to the right, the right resources to take care of those problems.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said, and I'll add two things. The first is that I think we need to sort of change how we evaluate information within the policymaking decision process. So I think of this idea of knowledge equity, right? So traditionally, our public policy processes are sort of grounded on traditional technical expertise or expertise that is sort of gathered in an academic or a professional setting. And oftentimes that deprioritizes sort of the lived experience of frontline communities, or place it at a different, in a different context. And I think that we need to ensure that we're holding up both those things equally when we're thinking about how we're informing policy and programmatic decisions. And then the last thing I'll say is investments. I think that we need to ensure that grant programs that are coming out of all levels of government is really ensuring that the way that they're constructed doesn't impose any unnecessary barriers on environmental justice communities gaining access to those programs, as well as even ensuring that those programs are achieving significant environmental justice outcomes, and not just sort of letting them be sort of reactive or passive in ensuring that those things happen.
And with everything else said,
this is Dr. Strand. I just want to inject this real quick. There's some cases where the state will pay communities to protect themselves. And there's acts like, for instance, in our city, we have host community inspectors. A lot of times, the community doesn't know these things. And if they're educated, they can do things, empower themselves with revenues to follow it. I just want to throw that in there. Thank you.
I mean, I just think plain and simple, like listen to the leaders who are most impacted. And that even means even if you don't agree with their strategy, like maybe they don't want the site shut down, but they want something mitigated. And you may not live in that community, but from a climate perspective, think every site needs to be shut down. Like follow that leadership. There's a more complex dynamic on why that local leader or that EJ community is saying a shutdown is not what we want right now, too. And so that is actually, I think, one of the harder things if you're trying to support an EJ community is to listen to their leadership when you actually disagree with their strategy.
That's a fantastic point, Veronica, because a lot of times, in EJ communities, some of these facilities are actually providing employment for people in the community too. And so a shutdown order can have, really kind of multiplier negative effect on the.
And with that, we'll conclude this evening's event. I'd like to thank our panelists and our moderator for your words and answers, and for Professor Bedi's guiding force. And I'd also like to thank our audience for attending. Good evening, good evening, everybody.